Welcome back to Secret Speaks. How has your day been? Now let's uncover the mystery hidden in today's story. The morning after laying my son to rest, I watched in shock as my daughter-in-law hauled my suitcase onto the porch and told me I had 1 week to disappear from the home where I had raised him. Neighbors stood frozen, whispering as if grief alone weren't enough punishment, and my granddaughter's tearful eyes locked with mine before her mother yanked her away. My name is Maggie Collins, and this is not just a story about loss, but about how I refused to be erased, how I struck back when they thought I was finished. The night in Janice's guest room felt endless, every creak of the old house pulling me back to the same thought I had been erased. I lay on my side, staring at the shadows moving along the wall, shadows that seemed more like memories than light. Every time my eyes drifted shut, the porch returned in sharp detail. The thud of the suitcase, the rasp of cardboard scraping against wood, Lydia's flat voice telling me I had a week. Sophie's wide eyes desperate but silent. I would jolt awake, chest-tight nails digging into my palms. I finally sat up and turned on the lamp. The yellow glow illuminated the box at my feet. I pulled it closer, my fingers digging through layers of my past. A stack of recipe cards with stains from butter and cocoa, the edges curled from use. Letters Daniel had sent me from Michigan State, the ink faded but his voice alive in every sentence. At the bottom was a pressed maple leaf still brittle after decades, one he had handed me when he was 9. He had said, "Keep this, Mom. It's the prettiest one I've ever seen." I had kept it. Now it had been tossed into a box like junk. I clutched the leaf between my palms and closed my eyes. That house had been more than wood and nails. It held the imprint of Daniel's life, the smell of Sunday pancakes, the marks on the door frame where I measured his height each year. To lose him and then lose the home was like losing him twice. Janice knocked softly and peeked in carrying a plate with chicken and green beans. I tried to eat, but couldn't. She set the plate aside and sat with me. "You don't deserve this, Maggie," she said firmly, her eyes fierce. "She's cruel, but she hasn't seen the last of you." Her certainty steadied me for a moment. After she left, I sat with Daniel's old wristwatch in my hand, listening to its faint tick. The sound was like his heartbeat reminding me he had existed, reminding me I wasn't crazy for feeling like half of me had been buried with him. I tried to sleep again, but dreams came instead. I saw strangers walking through my house, their shoes leaving tracks across the hardwood. Lydia's voice floated from the kitchen, smooth and cold, explaining the square footage and the price. I shouted, but no one heard. Sophie reached for me, her mouth forming my name, but Lydia pulled her away. I woke with a cry, sweat slick on my forehead. Morning came gray and thin. I splashed water on my face, staring at the woman in the mirror, wrinkled, tired eyes swollen from crying. But beneath that, something else sparked. Anger. I whispered to my reflection, "You are still here." Downstairs, Janice poured me coffee. "Sit," she said, pushing the mug toward me. The steam fogged my glasses, the warmth grounding me. We ate oatmeal in silence until she finally said, "You've faced storms before, Maggie. She thinks you're weak. She doesn't know you." Her words echoed in me. I had been a wife, a mother, a widow. I had raised 3 children on a shoestring, worked decades in the Oakland County archives to keep us afloat, balanced bills and grief and everything in between. I had endured worse than humiliation on a porch. The woman Lydia thought she could erase was still breathing. Later, I walked outside. The November air stung my lungs sharp and cold. Children in bright jackets clattered onto the school bus, their laughter echoing. A man raked leaves into piles. Across the street, Mrs. Parker paused with her terrier and gave me a tight, pitying smile before hurrying on. Mr. Hernandez waved from his driveway, hesitant. Their looks confirmed what I already feared. Everyone knew. I was the woman thrown out the day after burying her son. The shame burned, but under it something hardened. Lydia believed she had silenced me, but neighbors had seen. Sophie had seen. Janice had seen. My story was not hers to tell. I walked the block, my shoes crunching over frosted leaves. The houses looked familiar, yet each step felt alien, as if I was trespassing on my own past. I remembered Daniel's Little League practices in these yards, the block parties with sparklers and laughter, the fireworks over the 4th of July. Those memories still lived in me, though Lydia wanted to strip me of their setting. When I returned, Janice was folding laundry. She glanced up, her eyes careful. "You'll find your footing?" she said softly. I nodded, though inside I still felt the tremor of fear. What if Lydia cut me from Sophie's life completely? What if she sold the house before I found a way to fight back? The thought of losing both my granddaughter and my home left me hollow. That evening I sat again with the quilt square. The navy flannel was worn, the threads faintly fraying, but it carried Daniel's scent in memory, if not in truth. I pressed it to my cheek, picturing him around the campfire, his laughter bright. I whispered, "Daniel, I don't know how yet, but I won't let her erase me." The vow lingered in the air, stronger than grief, sharper than fear. For the first time since the funeral, I felt something other than despair. A thin wire of steel wove itself into my spine. Lydia thought I was finished. She was wrong. I folded the quilt square with care, placed it back in the box, and turned off the lamp. The room fell quiet except for the steady hum of the furnace. I lay down and closed my eyes, the ache still there, but underneath it now, a beginning. The morning sun spilled weakly through Janice's curtains, washing the room in a pale light that felt more like winter than late fall. I pushed myself upright, every muscle stiff, and sat on the edge of the bed with my hands gripping the blanket. The house was quiet, but my mind was anything but. The silence made space for the reality to sink deeper. Daniel was gone. Lydia had pushed me out, and the place I had called home for 4 decades was locked to me. Janice called up the stairs, asking if I wanted coffee. I managed a yes, though my voice cracked. In the kitchen, the smell of fresh brew and toast met me warm, but not comforting enough to chase away the chill in my chest. I sat down at her small oak table, and she slid a mug toward me. She didn't push me to talk, not yet. We both knew what weighed on the air. I tried to sip the coffee, but it turned bitter on my tongue. My thoughts wandered back to 2010, a year that had seemed full of promise then. Daniel had been 30, Lydia 28. They stood in the living room of the house, my house, their arms around each other, faces glowing. They wanted to make it theirs officially. I had agreed, believing it would keep our family bound together. We drew up a quitclaim deed transferring the house, but I had insisted on a clause. Janice, who worked at the county records office back then, helped me. It was a small safeguard tucked into the paperwork, something about my right to live there for as long as I wished. At the time, it seemed unnecessary. Daniel had laughed and told me I would never need to worry. I remembered his grin as he signed, how proud he looked, starting his family in the same home where he had been raised. Now that memory felt like betrayal, even though it wasn't his fault. He had been honest, loving, but death had stolen him from me, and Lydia had twisted his absence into power. I pressed my hands around the mug tighter, wishing he could walk through the door again and set everything right. Janice sat across from me, her eyes gentle but watchful. "You're quiet," she said softly. I shook my head, just remembering. 2010. How proud he was. How I thought Lydia was a blessing then. Janice's lips pressed into a thin line. She had never trusted Lydia fully, though she had been polite. Sometimes our friends see what we refuse to. The weight of the past pressed heavy on me. I excused myself and stepped outside. The November air bit my skin sharp and cold. Across the street, Mr. Hernandez waved politely, his eyes darting away quickly, not wanting to linger on my shame. "Mrs." Parker tugged her terrier along the sidewalk, her lips pursed as though holding back gossip. I knew what they had seen. I knew they had watched Lydia shove my belongings out like garbage. The humiliation sat heavy, but it was not the worst of it. The worst came in flashes of Sophie's face. The day after the funeral, when Lydia shoved me out, Sophie had stood behind her mother. Her eyes had been wide, her lips pressed tight as if she wanted to say something but could not. When our eyes met, she had looked at me with a kind of sorrow that no child should know. Then Lydia's hand had clamped on her shoulder and tugged her inside. The door had closed. That was the last image burned into me. I walked slowly down the block, dragging my coat tighter. I kept seeing Sophie at Christmas laughing as we baked cookies, sneaking chocolate chips from the bowl. I kept hearing her voice asking me to tell her stories about Daniel when he was a boy. She was only 14, still a child, and she had already lost her father. Now her mother was cutting her off from me. That thought was almost unbearable. Back inside, Janice handed me another mug of coffee. She studied me carefully. "You're carrying too much alone, Maggie." I wanted to tell her about the clause about the quitclaim deed, but it felt too fragile to speak aloud. Instead, I said, "It feels like I lost Daniel twice. First to death, and then to her." Janice's eyes softened. "You haven't lost yourself, though. Don't forget that." Her words stayed with me the rest of the day. I sat in the guest room staring at the boxes Lydia had packed for me. I opened another one and found Sophie's school photos tucked inside the ones she had given me each year. Her smile was shy in the earlier ones, brighter as she grew older. 14 now, with braces and long hair, trying to look older, but still my granddaughter. I held the photos to my chest, the ache swelling inside. As the evening drew near, I thought again of 2010, of the pen scratching across paper as we signed the deed. Daniel had kissed me on the cheek, promising I would always have a place there. I could still hear his voice. I could still see the ink drying. That promise was written into law. Lydia might not remember or might not care, but it was there. The ache in me was doubled now, grief and betrayal woven together so tightly I could hardly breathe. I had lost my son, my safe place, my role in Sophie's daily life, all in a single cruel sweep. And yet somewhere beneath it, that small spark Janice had spoken of still flickered. I stood by the window as night fell again, the street lamps flickering on. Cars passed their headlights, washing the road in pale beams. Life outside moved forward while mine stood frozen. I pressed Sophie's photo against the glass and whispered, "I'm still here." The ache was unbearable, but in that ache lived a seed of resolve. The next day began with a knock at Janice's door, sharp and insistent. I was still in my robe holding a cup of coffee when I heard Lydia's voice drifting in from the porch. It carried the same edge it always did, clipped and impatient, as if even speaking to me was a chore. By the time I stepped into the hallway, Janice was already opening the door. Lydia stood there in a gray wool coat, hair pulled back tight, and beside her was Becky. My daughter's eyes darted toward me, uncertain, as if she wasn't sure whether to hug me or avoid me. "We need to talk," Lydia said simply. "It is time we make some decisions." I set my cup down and crossed my arms, bracing myself. Decisions had already been made without me. Still, I followed them out to the car, knowing resistance now would only buy me more cruelty later. The drive was quiet. Lydia gripped the wheel tightly, staring straight ahead, while Becky fidgeted with her hands in her lap. I kept my gaze on the trees flashing by outside their branches, bare against the gray Michigan sky. When we turned into the parking lot and I saw the sign, my stomach dropped. Silver Pines Nursing Home. The letters on the weathered board looked bleak, almost threatening. I froze for a moment, but Lydia was already unbuckling her seatbelt. Becky murmured, "Mom, please just come inside and look." I stepped out slowly, my shoes crunching on gravel. The building loomed in front of me, brick walls, faded windows too small for comfort. Automatic doors opened with a hiss, and the smell hit me first, sharp disinfectant mingled with something stale and sour. The fluorescent lights inside buzzed overhead, washing everything in a pale, cold glow. A receptionist smiled mechanically and handed Lydia a clipboard. Without even looking at me, Lydia began filling out forms, her pen scratching quickly. Becky hovered beside her, avoiding my eyes. An aide arrived to give us a tour. I followed reluctantly down the hallway, the soles of my shoes squeaking against linoleum. The walls were painted yellow, cheerful in intent but lifeless in effect. Rooms lined the corridor doors half open. Inside, I saw twin beds with thin blankets, dressers barely large enough for a few belongings. A woman sat hunched in a chair by one window, staring blankly at the parking lot. Across the hall, a man struggled with the buttons of his cardigan, his hands trembling. The aide spoke brightly about activities, meals, medical care. Her voice echoed against the tile, but could not mask the truth I felt pressing in on me. This was a place where people were set aside, forgotten. Lydia's voice cut through. "See, Maggie, everything you could need. 3 meals a day. Nurses on call. No more stress." Becky finally spoke, her voice gentler. "Mom, I know it seems hard, but this would mean you're safe. With my work schedule and the kids, I can't always be there for you. At least here, we'd know someone is watching over you." I stopped walking. My throat felt tight, but my words came steady. I would rather sleep on Janice's sofa for the rest of my life than spend one day in here waiting to die. The aide blinked and excused herself quickly. Lydia stiffened, her jaw tightening. "You are being unreasonable. This is for your own good." I turned toward Becky, my daughter, my firstborn. My voice cracked as I asked, "Do you honestly believe this is what I deserve? After raising you, after giving my life to that house, after everything?" Becky's lips parted, but no sound came. She lowered her gaze, shame flickering across her face. Lydia stepped closer, her voice like ice. "Enough. You don't have the right to make these decisions anymore." A fire sparked inside me, then sharp and hot. For weeks, grief had smothered me, but in that hallway under those buzzing lights, I felt defiance push through. They could try to strip me of dignity, but they would not succeed. I turned and walked toward the exit. My footsteps echoed firm, each step louder than the last. Outside, the cold air slapped my cheeks and filled my lungs with something that felt like freedom. Behind me, Lydia called my name, her voice sharp with anger, but I did not stop. I reached the car, opened the door, and sat down, my hands steady in my lap. Minutes later, they joined me, the air thick with tension. Lydia gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. Becky sat silently, tears brimming in her eyes. I kept my gaze fixed on the horizon as the car rolled forward. The ride back to Janice's felt endless. No one spoke. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the faint hiss of the heater. I thought of the people I had just seen inside Silver Pines, their eyes vacant, their bodies slumped in chairs. I thought of Daniel, how he had always promised I would never be alone. I thought of Sophie, only 14, who needed me now more than ever. When the car finally pulled into Janice's driveway, Lydia turned in her seat, her eyes hard. "You are making a mistake. You will regret this." I met her gaze, and for the first time since Daniel's funeral, I felt no fear. No. The only mistake would be letting you decide my life for me. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she said nothing more. Becky's eyes filled, but she kept silent. I opened the door and stepped out, the wind whipping my coat. My feet crunched against the gravel as I walked back toward Janice's porch. Each step felt heavier than stone, but stronger than steel. Inside, Janice met me at the door, her expression asking the question she didn't voice. I shook my head, too drained to explain, and hung up my coat. She guided me to the couch and pressed a blanket over my lap. For a long time I sat there staring at nothing, the image of that hallway still burning in my mind. Yet beneath the exhaustion, the humiliation, and the sorrow, something else had taken root. They had tried to push me into silence, into surrender, but instead they had awakened the stubborn core that had carried me through every hardship of my life. I closed my eyes, the blanket warm across my knees, and breathed slowly. Whatever came next, I knew I would not go quietly. Janice saw something change in my face, and she moved without questions. She set a legal pad on the table and clicked a pen, the kind of simple gesture that felt like a handhold. I told her I needed to see everything I had kept from the sale to Daniel and Lydia in 2010. She nodded and went to the hall closet where we had stacked my boxes. Together, we pulled out the battered banker's box labeled house papers and set it between us like a small safe. I lifted the lid, and the familiar smell of old paper rose up, ink and dust and time. Inside were manila folders with my careful handwriting, mortgage payoffs from the 80s, property tax receipts, insurance policies. Near the bottom, I found the folder I had been afraid to hope for. Transfer to Daniel and Lydia, April 2010. My hands shook as I slid the documents free. There was the quitclaim deed with my name, and there's the notarization seal, faint but legible, and the writer I had insisted on. I scanned the paragraphs, my finger following the lines until I found the language I barely allowed myself to believe in. The clause sat there like a lighthouse in fog. Life estate reserved to grantor for the duration of her natural life. Right to occupy and use the premises. Prohibition on sale or conveyance that would extinguish said right without the written consent of grantor. Janice leaned over my shoulder and let out a small breath. "Paper does not forget," she said. "You were wise then, even if you did not know how much you would need it." I felt tears sting, but this time they were not hopeless. I asked Janice if she knew someone who could tell me exactly what to do next. She said Caroline Harris, and she said it with the certainty of someone who has watched a town grow around a few steady people. Caroline had notarized half the neighborhood and had a reputation for explaining the law in plain language. We called her office. A calm voice answered, and when Janice said my name and a few details, the voice told us to come by at noon. The morning stretched, and I kept rereading the clause as if the letters might vanish if I blinked too long. They did not. Noon finally came, and we drove into downtown Royal Oak, where Caroline kept a small office above a bakery. The stairwell smelled like sugar and coffee, and something about that ordinary scent grounded me. Caroline met us at the door with a firm handshake. She had bright eyes behind simple glasses and the measured manner of someone used to untangling knots. I laid the deed and the writer on her desk and folded my hands so she would not see them shake. She read without speaking, tracing the lines with a pen that did not move. The room was quiet except for the faint rumble of the mixer downstairs and the whisper of pages turning. She paused at the writer and read it again. Then she looked up and said that the language was clear and enforceable. I had retained a life estate. I could not be forced out while I lived, and the property could not be sold free of that interest without my written consent. I felt like the room tilted and then righted itself. I asked if Lydia could still list the house and attempt a sale. Caroline said she could try, but any buyer would be warned if we took the next step. She slid a blank form toward me and said, "Lis pendens." She explained that those words meant the world would be put on notice that there was a pending claim involving the property. Title companies would see it. Lenders would see it. Any sale would stall until the cloud cleared. She described how it worked without drama, step by step like a recipe. We would need a copy of the recorded deed with the writer and affidavit from me, describing my rights and the recent attempt to remove me and the lis pendens itself. We would file it at the Oakland County Register of Deeds. There would be a modest fee. Once recorded, the notice would attach to the legal description of the property like a flag no one could ignore. Janice sat straighter, and I could feel her pride like warmth on my back. Caroline kept going. She advised that I keep copies of everything, and that I prepare a simple letter to Lydia stating that I intended to exercise my rights. She suggested we attach the letter to the affidavit so there would be no misunderstanding. She also offered to notarize the affidavit and the lis pendens that afternoon so I could walk them across to the county building first thing in the morning. I asked the question I had been afraid to breathe. Would this stop Lydia from putting me in a facility? Caroline's answer was plain. A life estate meant I had the right to live in my home. It did not decide every piece of family conflict, but it set a boundary the law would respect. If Lydia tried to remove me or to sell anyway, the record would stand in the way, and if needed, a judge would. She spoke without judgment, only facts. It felt like hearing solid ground described under my feet. She printed the forms and slid them close. She watched me read them, then she watched me sign. Her notary seal pressed into the page with a soft click that sounded louder than it should. I held the papers as if they might float away, and she smiled a small smile and told me they were mine. When we stepped back onto the sidewalk, the air felt different. The late sun threw long shadows, and people walked past with bakery bags and coffee cups, ordinary lives carrying on. I was breathing a little easier for the first time in weeks. Janice linked her arm through mine the way she had when we were younger and said that we would go home and make a checklist for morning. Back at her kitchen table, we spread everything out. The deed and rider, the notarized affidavit with my statement of what had happened at the house and at Silver Pines, the completed lis pendens with the parcel number that Janice knew by heart, and I now wrote out carefully. Janice wrote a simple cover letter for the clerk and paper-clipped the fee. We labeled a folder for copies. I wrote Lydia's name at the top of a blank page and began drafting the letter Caroline had suggested. I kept it short and factual. I stated that I held a life estate and that I intended to return to my home. I stated that any attempt to sell or lease without my consent would be contested. I did not accuse. I did not argue. I simply placed the boundary on the page. We ate sandwiches standing at the counter, too focused to sit. Every so often, Janice would catch my eye and nod in a way that said, "Keep going." When the last list was checked and the last paper filed into the right stack, I sat back and exhaled. The house around us hummed with ordinary sounds: a neighbor's car door, a distant dog barking, the heating kicking on. For weeks, those sounds had felt like reminders that the world moved without me. Tonight, they sounded like a rhythm I could walk to. I took the deed again and read the clause one more time, slower now. I imagined Daniel at the table in 2010, pen in hand, laughing a little as I insisted on language I called old lady insurance. I imagined him now older in my mind than he ever got to be telling me I had done the right thing. The sadness swelled and then banked like a tide. In its place was steadier ground. Janice set an alarm for early. She tucked the folder into her tote bag and set it by the door. She put my coat on the chair and my scarf on top of it. We were acting like women who had something to do, not like victims. Before bed, I stood at the sink and washed my hands, watching the suds swirl down the drain. In the mirror over the faucet, my face still looked tired, but my eyes were clear. In the guest room, I laid the folder on the chair where I could see it when I woke. I picked up Daniel's quilt square for a moment and smoothed the fraying edge with my thumb. Then I set it down and turned off the lamp. The room sank into quiet. My breathing slowed. I did not know what Lydia would do when she learned that a wall she thought she controlled had just risen in front of her. I did not know whether she would scream or scheme or deny. I only knew that by noon tomorrow there would be ink in a county book that said I still existed. The thought steadied me as surely as a hand on my back. Sleep came cleaner than it had in weeks. It felt like stepping from a cold porch into a warm room. It felt like a chapter turning with a firm, deliberate page. The morning after we filed the papers, I woke with a strange calm, the kind that comes when you know you have finally taken a step forward. Janice dropped me at the county clerk's office, and we watched as the clerk slid the stamped copies across the counter, official and permanent. I tucked them into my folder like armor. On the way back to her house, we did not talk much, but when our eyes met, we both knew something had shifted. 2 days later, the phone rang in Janice's kitchen. I answered, expecting another condolence, or maybe a call from Becky. Instead, it was Caroline's steady voice. She told me the Liss pendants had already been picked up in the record system. Any title search would now show it. I thanked her quietly, my heart racing. She added almost kindly that these things often revealed themselves sooner than expected. That afternoon, I decided to take a slow walk around the block. The air was crisp and my scarf tugged in the wind. As I passed by my old house, the driveway caught my eye. Parked there was a black SUV I did not recognize. I stopped half hidden by the maple tree across the street. Through the window, I could see Lydia in the living room. She was speaking quickly, her hands gesturing toward the fireplace toward the staircase. Next to her stood a tall man in a tailored coat holding a folder. A realtor, I realized, and the man beside him was clearly a prospective buyer. My chest tightened. Watching them walk through the rooms felt like a knife twisting. I could almost hear Lydia's voice describing the square footage, the updated kitchen appliances, the so-called potential of the backyard. Every corner they toured was filled with memory. I clenched my fists and forced myself to breathe. I lingered longer than I meant to. After a while, they all stepped outside. The realtor spoke with polished ease, and the buyer nodded, glancing around the yard. Lydia's smile was wide, confident, almost smug. It struck me how easily she slipped into performance as though grief had never touched her. I turned away, unwilling to be seen, and walked back to Janice's with my heart pounding. That night sleep would not come. I imagined strangers repainting the walls, stripping the garden, tearing out Daniel's old room. I pressed the quilt square against my chest until dawn broke gray over the rooftops. The following day, just as Caroline had predicted, the call came. Lydia's voice, sharp and cracking, burst through the line before I could even say hello. "What did you do?" I sat very still, letting her words echo. She raged about embarrassment, about buyers walking away, about paperwork that made no sense. "You had no right," she spat. "But I did." I spoke calmly, steady, even as my pulse hammered. Clause 7. Lydia, I have every right, and the county has it on record now. Her silence on the other end was louder than her shouting. Then she hissed that this was not over and slammed the phone down. Later that evening, Janice relayed what a neighbor had seen. The buyer had returned to the office with the realtor, only to be told by the title company that the property carried a cloud. No lender would touch it. Without a clean title, the sale was impossible. The man had left furious papers stuffed into his briefcase. Lydia, left standing in her driveway, had flushed red with humiliation, her confidence crumbling in front of strangers she had hoped to impress. When Janice described it, I closed my eyes and breathed in slowly. For the first time since Daniel's funeral, I felt a flicker of justice. It was not public yet, not a spectacle for the whole town. But in that driveway in front of a buyer and a realtor, Lydia had been forced to face a truth she could not charm her way out of. She could not sell what was not hers to sell. I spent the rest of the evening in Janice's living room, the folder open on my lap, rereading the stamped list pendants. Each word steadied me. Each seal reminded me that I was not powerless. I thought of Daniel and how he had laughed when I insisted on that clause all those years ago. I whispered into the quiet that his mother was still here, still fighting. The ache in my chest had not gone. Grief still pressed down heavy and raw, but threaded through it now was something sharper, a beginning of defiance taking shape. Lydia had made her first attempt, and she had failed. I folded the papers back into the folder, set it carefully on the table, and leaned back. The house hummed with familiar sounds, the refrigerator cycling on the tick of the clock, Janice humming softly in the kitchen. For the first time in weeks, those sounds felt like rhythm rather than noise. I let them carry me until the weight of exhaustion finally pulled me toward sleep. The knock came just after breakfast, sharp and hurried. Janice was folding laundry in the living room, and I wiped my hands on a towel before opening the door. Becky stood on the porch with Ethan beside her. Both of them wore the strained expressions of people rehearsing what they would say before they even arrived. "Mom, can we come in?" Becky asked. Her voice was clipped but softer than usual, as if she wanted to sound gentle yet firm. I let them in and gestured toward the couch. Ethan cleared his throat while Becky sat forward, her hands twisting together. "We don't want this fight with Lydia to tear the family apart," she began. "The house is just a building. Maybe it's better to let it go to move on." I stared at her, my own daughter, speaking words that echoed Lydia's logic. My chest tightened, but I kept my voice steady. "That house is more than a building. It is where your father and I raised you, where Daniel grew up, where Sophie should feel her father's presence even now." Ethan leaned forward, his tone more direct. "Mom, we understand you're hurting, but this legal mess is going to drag everyone down. Lydia won't back off, and you'll only get more stressed. We think it would be best if you stepped aside gracefully." Something inside me snapped, not in rage but in clarity. I folded my hands in my lap and looked straight at them. This is my house. I reserved my rights long before this fight began, and no one, not Lydia, not a buyer, not even you, has the power to throw me out. Becky flinched at the sharpness in my tone. Her lips trembled, but she whispered, "Mom, I just want peace." "Peace does not come from surrender," I answered quietly. "It comes from standing where you belong." The silence stretched heavy until Ethan reached for Becky's hand, pulling her gently to her feet. He muttered something about giving me time to think, but I did not respond. I walked them to the door and closed it firmly behind them. My hands shook afterward, yet there was no regret. For the first time, I had spoken my truth to my own children without softening it. That afternoon, another knock came slower this time. When I opened the door, Michael stood there, my youngest. He was 34 now, but looked older, lines etched into his face, his jacket wrinkled. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile meant to disarm. "Hey, Mom, mind if I come in?" I stepped aside, uneasy already. He dropped onto a chair, rubbing his hands together. We talked briefly about the weather, about football, but I knew he hadn't come for that. At last he sighed and leaned toward me. "Things have been tough. Work hours got cut, bills are piling up. I could use a little help just until things straighten out." I listened, my heart aching. He had asked before more than once, and each time I had stretched myself thinner to give him something. But now, with Lydia circling Becky, wavering, and the house itself on the line, I felt a new steel settle in my chest. "Michael, I said you are a grown man. I cannot rescue you every time you fall behind. My resources are limited, and right now I need to use them to protect my home." His face darkened. "So you're choosing a pile of bricks over your own son?" I shook my head slowly. "I am choosing to stop pretending that I can fix your choices. I am choosing to place boundaries even with the people I love most." For a moment, he looked like the boy he once was, stubborn and wounded, but then he stood abruptly, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Fine," he muttered. "I'll figure it out myself." He walked out without another word, the door clicking shut behind him. I sat very still after he left, the echo of his footsteps fading. My heart hurt, but beneath the hurt was something else, something solid. For years I had bent under the weight of others' needs, always sacrificing. But that day I had said no both to Becky and Ethan's pleas and to Michael's request. Janice came in quietly and set a hand on my shoulder. "You did right, Maggie," she said softly. "Sometimes strength looks like refusal." I nodded, my throat tight. It did not feel triumphant. It felt necessary. As night fell, I sat by the window with the papers spread in front of me. The stamped clause, the affidavit, the lis pendens. Each one a reminder that I had already drawn a line and refused to let it be crossed. The day had added more lines this time with my children. Painful as it was, it marked the beginning of something new. The house lights outside flickered on one by one, neighbors settling in for the evening. I pressed Daniel's quilt square to my chest and whispered into the quiet room. "This fight is mine, and I will not step aside." The ache remained, but it was threaded with certainty. For the first time, I felt that even if I stood alone, I could still stand. The following afternoon, I walked past my old house on my way back from the market. The driveway was empty, but the front door stood slightly ajar. My stomach knotted. Lydia's car had been there earlier, and curiosity tugged at me stronger than fear. I crossed the street slowly, the grocery bag heavy in my hand, and stepped onto the familiar porch. Inside, the air was sharp with the smell of fresh paint. I froze in the doorway. Lydia stood in the living room, a bucket at her feet, a roller dripping with dark red paint in her hand. Long, jagged streaks smeared across the pale walls, wild and angry. The curtains that had hung for decades lay shredded on the floor, fabric torn in uneven strips. A mirror from the hallway lay shattered shards glinting across the rug. She did not notice me at first. She moved with a kind of reckless fury, slapping the roller against the wall, streaking it again, muttering under her breath. When she turned, her face was flushed, her hair clinging to her forehead. She saw me then, but instead of stopping, she let out a sharp laugh and dragged the roller across another stretch of wall. I set the bag of groceries on the floor quietly and reached into my purse for my phone. My hands trembled as I lifted it, the small click of the camera almost drowned out by the sound of the roller slapping the wall. I took photo after photo. The curtains, the broken glass, the red smears staining the walls like wounds. I stepped back into the hallway, capturing the ruin from every angle. My heart pounded so loud I thought she might hear it. But Lydia was lost in her rage, cursing under her breath, tearing at the remnants of fabric still clinging to the curtain rod. Each rip sounded like a scream. A small voice broke the chaos. "Mom, stop!" I turned quickly. Sophie stood at the foot of the stairs, her backpack still slung over her shoulder, her eyes wide with shock. She took in the paint, the glass, the shredded curtains, and then her gaze locked on her mother. Tears filled her eyes instantly. "Please stop!" she cried, her voice shaking. "This is Daddy's house too! How could you do this?" Lydia spun toward her daughter, the roller still dripping. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Sophie's sobs filled the room, raw and desperate. She dropped her backpack and ran not toward Lydia, but toward me. She collided with my chest, burying her face in my sweater, her shoulders shaking with grief. I wrapped my arms around her, my own tears blurring the destruction around us. It was the first time Sophie had chosen me over her mother, and it pierced me as deeply as it healed me. She clung to me, her small hands fisting in the fabric of my sleeve as if I were the only safe place left. Lydia's face twisted, caught between fury and something like shame. For a moment, she looked like a stranger, her features hard and sharp under the harsh light. She dropped the roller back into the bucket with a loud splash and turned away, muttering about how none of it mattered anyway. She stormed out the back door, slamming it so hard the glass rattled in the frame. The house fell silent except for Sophie's sobs. I held her tighter, smoothing her hair, whispering that it would be all right, even though I wasn't sure it would. I reached for my phone again, slipping it into my pocket. The evidence was there, but the moment with Sophie mattered more than any photograph. She lifted her tear-streaked face, her eyes searching mine. "Grandma, why is she doing this?" I brushed her hair back gently. "Because she's angry, sweetheart. Because she doesn't know how to handle her pain. But this isn't your fault. None of it is." Her chin trembled. "Daddy wouldn't want this." "No, he wouldn't," I whispered, my voice breaking. "He would want us to protect what he loved." Sophie leaned into me again, and I let her grief soak into my sweater. The wreckage around us felt unbearable, yet in that moment I understood the depth of Lydia's unraveling. She had shown her true face not in words but in destruction, and Sophie had seen it. When Sophie finally calmed, I led her to the porch away from the chaos inside. We sat together on the steps, the autumn air cool against our faces. She kept her hand in mine, gripping it tightly as though afraid I might vanish. I told her we would figure this out together, that she would always have me, no matter what her mother tried to destroy. Janice arrived later to pick me up, and when she saw the state of the house through the open door, her mouth tightened, but she said nothing. She only helped gather Sophie's things and walked us both to the car. Sophie refused to let go of my hand until the engine started. That night, as I sat in Janice's kitchen, I scrolled through the photographs. Each image was stark proof of what Lydia had done. The torn curtains, the shattered mirror, the red paint dripping down the walls like open wounds. I could have called the police. I could have pressed charges. But I slipped the phone back into my pocket instead. Not yet. The time would come. For now, it was enough to know that her mask had cracked and her own daughter had seen it. The dawn after that terrible evening came colder with frost, clinging to Janice's window panes, but for the first time, I felt the chill sharpen me instead of hollow me out. I sat at her kitchen table with my coffee cooling beside me and the folder of documents spread open across the wood. The photographs of Lydia's rampage, the affidavit Caroline had helped me draft, and the old quitclaim deed with Clause 7 circled in blue ink lay before me like weapons. For weeks, I had felt powerless, pushed from one humiliation to the next, but those pages reminded me that I was not a victim of her rage. Janice came in, still tying her robe, and sat across from me. Her eyes flicked over the papers and then back to my face. "You ready to finish this today, Maggie?" I nodded, my fingers tracing the edge of the embossed seal on the affidavit. She poured herself coffee and said Caroline would meet us at her office before noon. I folded everything carefully back into the folder, holding it against me like armor. The drive into Royal Oak felt different than all the anxious trips I had made in the past weeks. The streets were lined with bare trees and holiday lights just starting to appear on porches. The world was moving into winter, but I was moving into a kind of spring. Janice parked by the bakery, and we climbed the narrow stairs to Caroline's office. The smell of bread and sugar rose up ordinary and grounding. Caroline greeted us with a firm handshake and motioned me into the chair opposite her desk. She already had fresh copies printed, each one paper-clipped neatly, the language highlighted where it mattered most. Clause 7. Life estate. The right to occupy and use the premises for the duration of natural life. She read it aloud again, her voice steady as if she wanted the words to brand themselves into my bones. I signed slowly, my hand trembling, but not from doubt. Caroline pressed her notary seal into the paper with a decisive click. Then she slid the list pendants forward, already prepared with the legal description attached. She explained in her measured way how once recorded any buyer, lender, or realtor would see the cloud on title. The house could not be sold out from under me. Janice leaned back with a satisfied smile. "Paper does not forget," she murmured again, and I felt the truth of it. Together we walked across the street to the Oakland County Register of Deeds. The marble steps felt heavy under my feet, but each one carried me closer to reclaiming what was mine. Inside, the clerk barely looked at us as he took the stack, flipped through, and set them under his stamp. Thud, thud, thud. Each mark sounded final, each smear of ink more permanent than the last. He scrawled a file number across the top page and slid them back across the counter. "Recorded," he said flatly. I held the stamped papers as if they were warm in my hands. For weeks, Lydia's words had cut me, but now the law itself stood between us. Outside, the November sky was bright and thin, the air crisp. I breathed deeply, the papers pressed to my chest. Janice tucked her arm through mine. "You've done it," she whispered. Later that evening, I asked Lydia to meet me at the house. She arrived 20 minutes late, her sharp heels clicking against the porch boards. Her coat was buttoned tight, her mouth set in a thin line. She walked into the ruined living room and looked around, her expression carefully blank, though the red paint streaks and shattered glass told the story of her rage. I said nothing about it. Instead, I placed the stamped list pendants on the coffee table. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she read the seal and file number. "What is this supposed to mean?" "It means you cannot sell this house," I said evenly. "The title is clouded. Any buyer will see it. Any bank will refuse it. This home is not yours to trade away." Her lips twisted. "You're bluffing." I shook my head. I stood on those marble steps this morning and watched the clerk stamp every page. "It is in the record now. You cannot undo it." Her cheeks flushed. "You think this makes you strong?" I stepped closer, steadying my voice. "You gave me 1 week after my son's funeral. I am giving you 2. That is twice the mercy you showed me. 2 weeks to gather your things and move out." The silence stretched thick and heavy. Her eyes darted from my face to the seal, to the file number, and back again. For the first time, I saw doubt flicker in her. She knew it was real. She hissed, "You'll regret this." "Perhaps, but at least I will regret it in my own home." I left her standing in the wreck of the living room, her fury written on the walls she had ruined. Outside, the sky was dimming, the street lamps flickering on. Sophie stood at the curb, her backpack slung over one shoulder. When she saw me step out, she gave a small nod, her eyes bright with questions she didn't ask. I only reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. She didn't need details yet. She only needed to know that I had not surrendered. Back at Janice's, I opened the folder again under the warm glow of the lamp. The stamped pages felt heavier than paper, as if they carried Daniel's promise from all those years ago. The ache of his loss still tore at me, but beside it burned something new. Resolve. For weeks, Lydia had pushed me like I was nothing, but the balance had shifted. Her first buyer had walked away, her mask had cracked in front of Sophie, and now the law itself barred her path. I set the folder down, folded my hands, and closed my eyes. The house was no longer slipping away. It was anchored, protected by words Daniel had once laughed about, words that now shielded me. For the first time since the funeral, I felt not just grief, but power. Quiet, steady, unyielding power. 2 days later, I returned to the house with Janice at my side, determined to check on the damage and begin planning repairs. The yard was quiet except for the rustle of dry leaves across the driveway. As I stepped onto the porch, I heard raised voices inside. Sophie's thin voice carried first sharp with hurt, followed by Lydia's low and seething. My heart clenched as I pushed the door open. The living room still bore scars of Lydia's tantrums, streaks of red paint hardened on the walls, shards of glass swept to the side in a careless pile. Lydia stood in the center, her hands on her hips, her face twisted with fury. Sophie was near the staircase, clutching her backpack as though it could shield her. "You see what she's done," Lydia snapped, pointing toward me as if I had just walked into a crime scene. "She's taken everything from us, Sophie. That house, our security, every chance we had. She stole it all." Sophie's eyes widened. She looked from her mother to me, her lips trembling. "No, that's not true," she whispered, her voice quaking but growing steadier. "You're the one who threw her out after Dad died. You put her things on the porch." "I saw you." Lydia's face froze, then darkened. "Don't you dare speak to me like that," she hissed. "Everything I've done is for you." Sophie shook her head violently, tears spilling down her cheeks. "No, you're lying. Grandma didn't take anything. You tried to take everything from her." The words struck like lightning. Lydia staggered as if slapped, her mouth opening in protest, but no sound came. Sophie dropped her backpack and ran to me, pressing herself against my side. Her small body shook with sobs, her arms wrapping around my waist. I held her close, stroking her hair, my own throat aching. From the doorway, Becky appeared, having just arrived. She froze at the sight, her eyes darting from the ruined walls to her sister-in-law's furious face to her own mother clutching Sophie. "What's going on here?" Becky demanded, her voice sharp but unsettled. Lydia spun toward her. "You should be asking your mother. She's manipulating Sophie, turning her against me. She's the reason this family is falling apart." Sophie pulled back just enough to cry out. "That's not true. Grandma didn't do anything. You're the one who broke the mirrors, tore the curtains painted on the walls." "I saw you." Becky's gaze whipped back to Lydia, shock flashing across her features. "Is that true?" she asked, her tone laced with disbelief. Lydia sputtered, searching for words, but Becky's eyes narrowed. "For weeks you've told us she was unstable, that she was clinging to something that wasn't hers. But now I see the mess with my own eyes. And Sophie saw it too." The silence that followed was thick and raw. Sophie buried her face against me again. Becky stepped farther into the room, her shoulders tense. Lydia's expression wavered between anger and desperation, but her usual sharp confidence faltered. "You don't understand," Lydia stammered. "This house was supposed to be our chance. Without it, we have nothing." Becky's voice rose tight with frustration. "And you thought the solution was to destroy it, to humiliate my mother, to make Sophie cry." For the first time, I saw Becky truly look at Lydia without blind loyalty. Her brow furrowed, her lips pressed tight, and the doubt etched itself clear across her face. I pulled Sophie closer and spoke softly, though every word carried. This house was Daniel's legacy and mine before his. It was never meant to be a prize or a weapon. It was meant to hold this family together. Becky's eyes filled with tears. She glanced at me, then at Sophie still trembling in my arms. Slowly she nodded. "Maybe Mom's been right all along." Lydia's mouth fell open, betrayal flashing in her eyes, as Becky stepped toward us instead of her. She tried again, her voice breaking. "Becky, you can't side with her. If you do, we lose everything." Becky's jaw set. "No, Lydia. I think we already lost too much when Daniel died, and you've been making it worse." The room went still. Lydia's breath came fast, her chest heaving, but her words had nowhere to land. Sophie's sobs quieted to soft hiccups, her arms still tight around me. Becky's face was pale, but resolute. In that moment, I realized something had shifted. For weeks, Lydia had painted me as the villain, the burden, the thief. But her own rage had betrayed her, and Sophie's truth had pierced through the lies. Becky, who had doubted me, now looked at me with something close to regret and recognition. Janice stepped quietly into the room, then having followed me inside and placed a steadying hand on my shoulder. She didn't need to speak. The look in Becky's eyes told me enough. The walls Lydia had built inside this family were beginning to crumble. Lydia turned away, her shoulders rigid, her voice low and bitter. "This isn't over." But for the first time, I knew it was beginning to end. The key turned stiffly in the lock, the door groaning as it swung open. The air inside the house was cool and stale, carrying the faint scent of paint and dust. I stepped over the threshold with Sophie at my side, her hand still gripping mine tightly. For a moment, I just stood there, letting the weight of it wash over me. My home. After all the shouting, the threats, the humiliation, it was mine still. Sophie's eyes darted around the living room. The walls bore the angry streaks of red paint dried in harsh, uneven strokes. The curtains were gone, only tattered threads left on the rods. Shards of the broken mirror glimmered faintly in a pile against the wall. She pressed closer to me, whispering that it felt strange, like a dream turned sideways. I squeezed her hand. "It's still our place," I said. "Damage can be mended. What matters is that it's still standing, and so are we." Janice followed us in her arms folded as she took in the wreckage. Her voice was calm, firm. "The neighbors saw enough today. Lydia's mask is gone for good. She'll never have the same power again." We moved slowly through the rooms. Every step carried memories, Daniel's laughter spilling down the staircase, birthdays in the dining room, Becky practicing piano in the den. Each memory collided with the wreckage Lydia had left, but instead of breaking me, it fueled something deeper. Survival had shifted to victory, not loud or boastful, but steady like roots gripping earth. Sophie let go of my hand long enough to kneel by the broken mirror. Her reflection fractured into a dozen pieces, her face lined with sadness. She touched one shard gently, then turned to me with tears brimming in her eyes. "Why would she do this, Grandma?" "Because she thought destroying things would give her control," I said softly. "But control doesn't come from breaking. It comes from building, from holding on when others want you to fall." Her small shoulders lifted as she breathed, and she seemed older in that moment, as if grief had aged her faster than childhood ever should. She stood and pressed herself into my arms. I held her close, letting her tears sink into my sweater. We sat on the old couch for a long while, the silence thick, but not unbearable. Outside, I could still hear the muffled voices of neighbors dispersing their footsteps crunching against the sidewalk. They had witnessed Lydia's humiliation, the truck rumbling away with her things. Now the street was quieting, returning to its ordinary rhythm. Janice broke the silence. "Maggie, you need to reclaim this space. Fix what she tried to ruin. Each repair will be a statement." I nodded, though my eyes stayed on Sophie. She had stopped crying but still clung to me, her small frame shaking now and then with the remnants of her sobs. I thought of Daniel, how fiercely he had loved his daughter, how he would have hated to see her caught between loyalty to her mother and the truth she had just spoken aloud. Becky appeared in the doorway, then hesitant, her eyes searching the room. She looked worn, her hands twisting at the strap of her purse. I wasn't sure if she had come to help or to argue, but when her gaze fell on Sophie in my arms, her face softened. "I didn't come to fight," she said quietly. I needed to see." Her eyes landed on the painted walls, the broken glass, and then on me. For the first time in years, she looked at me not as a burden, but as a mother who had endured. Sophie pulled away enough to look at her aunt. "Mom lied, Becky. She said Grandma stole from us, but it wasn't true. You saw it too." Becky swallowed hard. Her eyes shimmered, but she nodded slowly. "I did." Something in my chest loosened. Becky's acknowledgement was small, but it felt like the start of repair. The division Lydia had sown between us was cracking piece by piece. The evening stretched on. Janice busied herself sweeping glass into a dustpan, while Becky helped Sophie gather her things. I moved through the house room by room, touching the walls, the door frames, the windowsills. Each scar left by Lydia was a reminder of her rage, but each scar would soon be covered, repaired, painted fresh. When the work paused and the quiet settled in, I stood in the living room window and looked out. The street lamps glowed softly, the neighborhood calm again. A few lingering neighbors gave small nods as they passed, their glances carrying respect rather than pity. They had seen the fight, and they had seen the outcome. Sophie curled up beside me on the couch, drifting into sleep with her head on my lap. Becky sat across the room, her hands folded, her expression contemplative. She met my gaze and whispered that maybe she had been wrong, that maybe strength wasn't in giving in, but in standing firm. I smoothed Sophie's hair and whispered back that we all learn in our own time. The house hummed with stillness, the kind that comes not from emptiness, but from something hard won. For the first time since Daniel's funeral, I felt the walls around me offering shelter instead of grief. Lydia was gone, her humiliation carried off in that truck, her power broken in front of the very people she had tried to impress. The house was battered, yes, but it was still mine. And as I looked at Becky, at Janice, at Sophie breathing softly against me, I knew it was more than wood and plaster. It was proof that I had survived, proof that I had struck back not with fists or fury, but with endurance, truth, and law. Tomorrow there would be repairs, phone calls, new curtains, fresh paint. But tonight there was rest. Tonight there was peace. The next morning I rose early, the house quiet, except for the faint tick of the old clock in the hallway. Sophie was still asleep in the guest room at Janice's, curled under a quilt that had once been Daniel's. I dressed quickly and walked across the street to my house. The cold air bit at my cheeks, but when I unlocked the door and stepped inside, I felt warmth of another kind. It was no longer Lydia's chaos waiting for me. It was mine to reclaim. I began in the living room. The red paint that Lydia had slashed across the walls had dried into ugly scars, but I rolled up my sleeves and began scrubbing. It came off slowly, leaving pale streaks where the brush had bitten into the plaster. Every motion of the sponge felt like reclaiming a piece of my life. The broken glass was swept into bags, the torn fabric of the curtains bundled into piles for the trash. By mid-morning, the front door creaked open and Eleanor appeared, her hair tucked under a knitted cap, a basket of muffins in one hand and a toolkit in the other. She kissed my cheek and said she had come to help patch what she could. Nora arrived not long after with a bundle of fresh curtains she had pulled from her own linen closet. Grace followed with gardening gloves tucked into her pockets, her smile wide and determined. We set to work together, laughter rising between us as though the walls themselves remembered better days. Eleanor replaced the curtain rods while Nora pressed a cool hand against my arm, reminding me to pause and sip water. Grace pried open the back door that had been swollen shut with age and stepped into the garden where weeds had crept through the flower beds Lydia had neglected. She knelt in the cold earth, humming softly as she pulled the roots free. By afternoon, the house was already changing. Sunlight streamed through new curtains, soft and clean. The smell of muffins mixed with the lemon of cleaning solution. The neighbors passing by paused at the gate, nodding, some even stopping to offer tools or spare paint. The house that had been marked by rage was filling with community, each brushstroke and nail hammered into the wall a kind of healing. Sophie joined us after lunch, pulling on gloves too big for her hands. She followed Grace into the garden and knelt beside her, tugging weeds with determination. "Grandma, she said we should plant roses. Daddy always said roses were strong. We will," I promised, pressing soil around the first cleared patch. Roses for strength, daisies for hope, and maybe lavender for peace. As the garden began to clear, I returned inside to sort through the piles of torn fabric. Lydia had destroyed curtains and linens, but there were also pieces of Daniel's old shirts folded in the back of the closet where she hadn't touched them. I laid them across the dining table, smoothing each one with careful hands. The faded blue flannel he wore on chilly nights, the cotton shirt with tiny checks he had worn when teaching Sophie how to ride her bike, the sweatshirt from his college years. Nora came and stood beside me. "Patchwork," she said quietly. "You should make something new out of these pieces." The idea settled into me like a spark. That night, after the others had gone, I threaded my old sewing machine and began stitching. One square, then another. The fabric hummed under the needle, the scraps binding together into a new design. The quilt began to take shape, not polished or perfect, but vibrant with memory. Each stitch was a moment reclaimed, each seam a reminder that broken things could be bound together again. Sophie hovered near, watching intently. "Can I help?" she asked, holding a square of flannel in her hands. I guided her small fingers, showing her how to hold the fabric steady as I sewed. Her smile grew as she watched the pieces join. She whispered that it felt like making something whole again. By the time the clock chimed midnight, a patchwork spread lay across the dining table. It was rough, the edges uneven, but when I laid my hand across it, I felt Daniel's presence in every square. The quilt was not just cloth. It was proof that healing could be stitched from scraps, that what had been torn apart could return in another form. The next day, Eleanor and Nora returned with paint cans, and we began covering the last of the red streaks. The strokes of white rolled clean and smooth, hiding Lydia's anger under a fresh layer of calm. Grace trimmed the garden beds and planted bulbs that would bloom in spring. Sophie carried buckets of water, her laughter mingling with the scrape of rakes and the thump of hammers. Neighbors passing by stopped again, some stepping onto the porch with plates of cookies, others offering spare plants from their own yards. The house had become a hive of small kindnesses, each one stitching me back into the fabric of the community. That evening, when the work paused and the house was quiet again, I spread the patchwork quilt across the couch. Sophie climbed under it and patted the space beside her. I settled down and pulled the quilt over both of us. She traced the seams with her finger and whispered, "It feels like Daddy's arms." I pressed my cheek to her hair, tears stinging my eyes. "It feels like home," I said. The walls gleamed with fresh paint, the curtains fluttered softly in the night breeze, and the scent of turned earth drifted in from the garden. The scars Lydia had left behind were still there beneath the surface, but they no longer defined the space. The house was alive again, pieced back together, just like the quilt, not perfect, but whole in its own way. And as Sophie drifted to sleep against me, the patchwork warm over our shoulders, I felt that healing was not just possible, but already here. The smell of roasted chicken filled the kitchen as I pulled the pan from the oven, steam rising into the warm light. The table was already set with simple plates and glasses, a vase of late autumn flowers in the center. I had not hosted a dinner in months, not since before the funeral, but tonight felt different. Tonight was about reclaiming not just a house, but a family. Janice arrived first with a loaf of bread she had baked that morning, her cheeks flushed from the cold. Eleanor and Nora followed carrying pies, and Grace came last, arms full of cider bottles that clinked gently together. Their laughter filled the entryway as they shed coats and scarves, voices bright and easy. For weeks they had been my strength in quiet moments, and now their joy seemed to weave itself into the very walls. Becky stepped through the doorway not long after Sophie's hand tucked in hers. My daughter's face was tight with nerves, her eyes darting around the freshly painted living room as if she were walking into a church. Sophie pulled free and ran to me, her arms wrapping tight around my waist. "Grandma, it looks beautiful," she whispered. I kissed her hair and led her into the dining room where the quilt I had finished was draped over the back of a chair. She traced its seams proudly for the others to see. Becky lingered at the threshold watching. I caught her gaze and motioned for her to sit. When everyone had gathered plates full and candles flickering, Becky cleared her throat. The chatter faded. She set her fork down, her hands trembling slightly. "Mom," she said, her voice breaking. "I owe you an apology. I should have stood by you sooner. I listened to Lydia when I should have listened to my own heart." The room stilled. My chest ached, but I reached across the table and took her hand. The weight of her fingers in mine was fragile but real. "What matters is, you are here now," I told her softly. "Families break, but they can mend too." Becky's eyes filled with tears. "I promise to do better," she whispered. Sophie leaned forward, sliding her small hand over mine where it rested on Becky's. "You don't have to promise, Aunt Becky," she said with the blunt honesty of a child. "You just have to stay." The laughter that followed was soft but healing, lifting the tension from the room. Conversation returned warmer now, filled with memories of Daniel's stories from years past, and even gentle jokes about my stubborn streak. The house that had echoed with shouting and grief was filled again with laughter and clinking glasses. Later, when the plates were cleared and dessert finished, Sophie climbed onto the couch and pulled the patchwork quilt over her lap. She looked at me across the room, her voice small but sure. "Grandma, I still need you." The words pierced straight into me. I crossed the room, sat beside her, and wrapped the quilt around us both. "You will always have me," I said. The others sat quietly, the weight of the moment sinking in. Janice smiled softly, her eyes glistening. Grace reached for my shoulder, her hand warm and firm. Eleanor and Nora exchanged a knowing look, the kind only old friends can share. When the evening ended and coats were gathered again, the air outside was crisp with the smell of wood smoke drifting from chimneys. Neighbors walking by lifted their hands in greeting, nodding at the sound of laughter spilling from my doorway. The community that had once watched my humiliation now bore witness to my healing. After everyone left and the house was quiet again, I stood alone in the living room. The new curtains swayed gently in the night breeze, the walls clean and bright. The quilt lay across the couch, stitched from scraps of Daniel's life, warm with memory. My heart still carried grief, but it carried strength beside it. I spoke into the silence, my voice steady. They thought they could throw me out, but no one has the right to take away my home. I lost my son, but I did not lose myself. I turned off the lights, the house glowing softly in the dark, and felt a peace settle in at last. If this story touched you, share it so others know that dignity and justice can never be taken away. The last of the candlelight flickered low on the table, leaving the room in a soft amber glow. I sat still, my hands folded over the quilt in my lap, listening to the quiet hum of the house. For months, this silence had been heavy, filled with grief and fear, but tonight it carried something different. It was steady, peaceful, like the calm after a storm. The air smelled faintly of roasted chicken and cinnamon from the pie Becky had brought, and I let the scent anchor me to the moment. I rose and walked into the living room, the quilt dragging gently behind me as I spread it across the couch. My eyes traced each square stitched from Daniel's shirts, holding memories of birthdays, late-night talks, and mornings spent drinking coffee on this very porch. The fabric was soft, faded, but bound tightly together. It reminded me of what I had become, what my family was becoming again. The door opened quietly, and Becky stepped in her shoulders, hunched her face flushed from the cold. She held herself like someone unsure if they belonged. "Mom," she whispered, "I needed to come back. I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing Sophie's words at the table, and I realized how wrong I've been. Lydia twisted everything, but I let her voice matter more than yours." Her eyes searched mine, raw and vulnerable. I crossed the room and held her, and for the first time in years, she let herself lean into me. "Families stumble," I said gently, "but we can always find our way back." She pulled away just enough to wipe her cheeks. "Sophie needs you," she said, and then after a pause, "So do I." The next morning, the house was alive with small sounds again. Sophie padded into the kitchen humming as she poured herself cereal. Becky joined us later with groceries in her arms, determined to cook for us. Janice arrived in the afternoon carrying fabric scraps, teasing that she wanted her crooked stitches in the next quilt. Eleanor and Nora dropped by with coffee and pie, and Grace came with seeds and a promise that the garden would bloom come spring. The house pulsed with life, not the bitter noise of Lydia's rage, but the soft rhythms of family and friends rebuilding something together. Neighbors noticed, too. They passed slowly on the sidewalk, some stopping at the gate with tools or jars of jam, others offering a quick smile. Their eyes held respect now, not pity. They had seen Lydia humiliated, her mask ripped away by her own choices, and they had seen me remain. One afternoon, Sophie tugged at my sleeve as we worked in the garden. "Grandma, we should plant roses here," she said, pointing to a bare patch of soil. "Daddy always told me roses were strong." I bent beside her, pressing my hand into the cold earth. "We will, sweetheart. Roses for strength, daisies for hope, lavender for peace." She smiled, and for a moment I saw Daniel's grin shining through her. As winter deepened, our evenings fell into a rhythm. We sat by the fire sipping cider, the quilt draped over our laps. Sometimes Janice joined us, sometimes Becky, sometimes it was just Sophie and me. The quiet no longer felt empty, but full of healing. Becky softened with every visit, her voice gentler, her eyes warmer, her walls slowly lowering. Sophie grew brighter too, skipping through the halls singing as she helped with chores, her laughter ringing like a bell. On Christmas Eve, the house filled again. Janice bustled in with bread Grace, with a casserole Eleanor and Nora with a pie. Becky stood at my side helping Sophie carry dishes to the table. Laughter filled the walls, the kind that echoes deep and lingers. For the first time since Daniel's death, the house felt not like a place of mourning, but of life again. After the last guest left and Sophie was tucked into bed, I walked slowly through each room. The walls gleamed with fresh paint, the curtains swayed in the night breeze, the garden lay asleep under a blanket of snow. I paused in the living room watching the fire burn low, the quilt folded neatly across the couch. In the window, I caught my reflection lined with age and grief, but strong, steady, and unbroken. I thought of Daniel, his laugh, his promise that this home would always be mine. I thought of Lydia leaving under the weight of every neighbor's eyes, her anger no shield against the truth. I thought of Becky's hand in mine, Sophie's fierce defense, Janice's unwavering loyalty, and the friends who had shown up day after day. All of it stitched together like the quilt itself into something whole and enduring. "No one can take this from me," I whispered to the empty room. "They tried to strip me of everything, but I am still here. I lost my son, but I did not lose myself." The house seemed to hold the words, its silence warm and certain. The fire cracked softly, the snow drifted outside, and for the first time in a long while, I felt peace settle fully inside me. If this story touched your heart, share it so others know that dignity and justice can never be taken away. Let it be a reminder that even when cruelty tries to push us out, we can stand firm. Even when grief breaks us, we can rebuild. And even when the world doubts us, we can hold fast to what is ours.